So this person had an appointment with the bank manager and went down to the bank manager and said, I got this instrument back and I want to know why I haven't gotten the funds. And the bank manager looked at the instrument and talked with this person for a little while. And the bank manager basically suggested that the manager saw two problems. First problem was there was no endorsement. The second problem was that the payor obviously had not done the right thing with their bank because the funds should have transferred from the payor's bank. So that person came back to my friend in California who told him that, and he called me up. Now, I had been talking with Victoria Joy about, at least a full 3 months ago or more, when she was in the process of using a check on a closed account to purchase that house out in California. And the check that she had issued on the closed account and given to the payee, the seller of the house, basically the same thing happened. That payer of the house, or seller of the house, the payee, got the instrument back from his bank, and it was stamped account closed on the front. And he had talked to his banker about it, and his banker said, well, there's instructions that come from us, the payee bank, and there's instructions that come from the payor bank, and that's up to the drawer of the check. And that's the information that he reported back to us about 3 months ago. Now, notice at no time was there any discussion going down in either of these two conversations about the Secretary of Treasury or the Department of the Treasury Bank. Now, do not jump to the conclusion that they're not involved. And also understand that these are statements coming out of bank managers or whatever, somewhat on the public side. But remember, concealed in whatever it is that they're saying, there's got to be some knowledge of the truth. And so what we're looking at now as a possible putting all of this together and looking at maybe what the process might be or what's going on here looks a little bit like maybe the following based on logic, but not based on any empirical evidence of having anybody done this yet. So don't go jumping out there doing everything thinking that this is a program which has been much researched and has the same effects coming out all the time. This is a result of trying to piece together bits and pieces and odds and ends and come up with anything that sounds logical in terms of a public-private procedure, which would make sense. And so it would appear as though a lot of this paperwork that's been done by Barton Butts, where he literally does a bill of exchange, and with that bill of exchange sends along a letter of advice, which we have kind of showed is very, very similar and should probably take on the capacity of a letter of credit, along with the contract that's been offered and accepted. And all of this goes back to the payee, who's then supposed to take it to the payee bank, who's then supposed to sort of forward this to supposedly the Secretary of Treasury, etc. And then we've talked also about the checks on a closed account, where we've surmised that maybe what you do is you send the check on the closed account to the payee, but maybe you send copies of that plus the letter of credit or letter of advice directly to the Secretary of Treasury, so that by time the check on the closed account comes up there for clearance, your letter of advice and documentation to the Secretary of Treasury appears as a certificate of deposit or a letter of credit, whereby with the second witness he's authorized to pay it by transferring funds. But then again, remember in Barton Butts' letter of instruction, Barton is not saying that the funds are going to come out of Treasury, is he? With Barton Butts' letter of advice, he's telling the payee bank that the payee bank is authorized to place funds in the payee's account if the Secretary of Treasury, Department of Treasury bank does not dishonor the presentment within 10 to 15 days. So it would appear as though no funds, quote unquote, are coming out of the Secretary of Treasury or Department of Treasury bank, although they're certainly aware that there's been something done there and they've got the documentation. So I guess one of the questions is, before we go back to the new concepts, is, under the Barton Butts style, if the payee bank is going to transfer funds into the payee's account, how is the payee bank going to be made whole? I think the answer to that is very straightforward. Remember a while back when we were talking about this, people were saying, what could an exemption be used for? And remember, one of the answers was very simple. Corporations can trade exemptions like they do, quote, money, unquote. And in particular, if a bank is holding an exemption, what could the bank use that exemption for? To discharge Treasury liabilities. So in reality, if the payee bank is holding the paper bill of exchange, and there has been a Fed wire transfer to the Department of Treasury bank and the Secretary of Treasury, and they don't dishonor the presentment within the open window time, I think it's 15 days, then basically the bill of exchange physically in the possession of the payee bank has been approved and not dishonored by Treasury. And that becomes a working asset of the bank. Consequently, they can generate the funds, to place the funds in the payee's account to offset the bill of exchange, which is a Treasury asset, which the bank now gets to use. Now, knowing that that transaction is feasible, plausible, and in fact could take place, we come back to the new empirical evidence now that comes to us from two bankers, whereas when it was from one banker, we kept saying, well, they're giving us the truth here, what's going on? Now it's come from two bankers. Put this one in the back of your mind and think about it. When you tender a check to a payee, do you think it's necessary that the payee understand really whether that check is on an open or closed account? I don't think it makes any difference what they know. In fact, you're probably better off if they're ignorant, and so is the Federal Reserve System and everybody else. Too much truth or too many fuzzy documents could start stirring up all kinds of inquiries. So quite possibly whoever has generated this procedure would most likely like to see the transactions on the asset side blend in with transactions on the liability side, so that if you're one of the sleeping sheeple, no matter what happens to you and who you associate with, you won't get woke up by anything that's out of the ordinary. Remember what happened to my friend Nick and all his buddies out in Idaho? By doing what they're doing, they woke up the sleeping sheeple, the ones who are angry internally. And because they woke them up, these people started getting angry externally. And that's not what the bankers, the government, or anybody else wants anyone to do. Keep these people sleeping. So, why should we be tendering all of these documents to the payee? The payee, A, neither understands them, B, doesn't want to do anything with them when he gets them anyway, and C, generally goes down to third parties like law enforcement and stuff and starts creating problems. You're giving them an excuse to create charges. If you're not going to deliver the letters of credit and the letters of advice to the payee with your instrument, who would they go to? We have assumed and presumed they ought to go to the Secretary of Treasury. Well, certainly that party has a fiduciary duty to protect the window between the public and the private, and his office and his personnel have an interest in what's happening. But possibly if more and more people start understanding what the law is and want to start obeying the law instead of being in treason to the law by trying to spend money which doesn't exist, creating a public liability which saddles the public with increasing levels of liability and debt through debt, then wouldn't it make more sense to have delegated some of that authority to a lower level? If you're not going to send it to the Secretary of Treasury, who would you reposit it with? Which bank? Your bank. If you have an open account, do you send your letters of credit to the Secretary of Treasury? No. When you told your bank to change the status to a closed account, are they still your bank? You bet. Are they still managing that account? You bet. Why aren't you placing your letters of credit with the administrators of your bank? Doesn't it seem to be very logical now? See, what happens when people don't do letters of credit with their own bank? Their own bank, when you write these checks on closed accounts, the first thing that these banks want to do is the payee bank doesn't want to get into Fedwire. It wants to get into the electronic transfer between the banks, which goes through the ACS system rather than the Fedwire system, the accounting clearinghouses system. And by going through the banking system of accounting clearinghouse, the advice always comes back to the payee bank that the account is closed, which is a true fact. And then we try to go down and tell a whole cotton-picking banking system that they're screwing this thing up and they don't know how to get it right, that they ought to be going through the Fedwire transfer. Isn't it just possible that if you would send your letters of instruction, letters of credit, and advice to your bank to deal with the Fedwire transfer on a transaction by transaction, and let your bank handle the transaction between Treasury and the payee bank, that not only makes sense as far as efficiencies of transactions, but the whole system's set up to do that. And it gives you, your bank, and their fiduciary capacity to you to administrate an error if your bank fails to carry this out. See, many of the times that we've jumped from one problem into a resolution, but we didn't do things too logically, we just jumped from one problem to another problem, moving the problem along the chain of command there, and still didn't get a remedy. Is it entirely possible, and we all know that you can be substantively correct 100% what you're doing, and be a little bit wrong in your procedure and get no remedy, that maybe this might be part of the answer as to what's going on. Certainly, if you've drafted your own bank with the letter of credit and the request and letter of advice and had them sort it out, then if your bank of the closed account has tendered the letter of credit by Fedwire to the Secretary of Treasury, Department of Treasury Bank, and isn't your bank usually the bank that has the funds out of which the drawing on the instrument is going to be made and transferred to the payee's bank? So if your bank has the instruction to go through the Fedwire to get approval with the Secretary of Treasury at the open window, and there is no dishonor of that within the open window time slot of 15 days, then isn't it your bank with your closed account that's going to hold the bill of exchange, which should never go back to the payee's bank and never go back to the payee? Isn't that bill of exchange going to stay with your bank? And isn't that going to be their letter of credit, which is going to provide them with the assets that your bank is going to have that can be used to discharge liabilities with the Treasury? And will your bank now set up and transfer funds to the payee bank so the payee bank and the payee's account will be made whole? And the payee will not have a clue. hide in plain sight. Now, based upon several of the inputs that have come to several people, there has been a development of the meetings of the minds of what makes sense and what sounds like a logical procedure. And what we've just placed before you is the result of that input and that thinking now in terms of amending procedures to possibly give us remedies. Now remember, because you know a procedure and can carry out an action, does not mean we're advocating that you do a procedure and carry anything out. Because you know how to build and blow up a nuclear weapon cannot translate into the concept that we're advocating it or telling you to do it, or that it's even wise to do it. We've been talking about procedure. If you don't understand the substance of what you're getting involved in, don't go out and build a thermonuclear weapon just because you've been told how to do it. It's probably going to get you into a lot of trouble. We're already trying to understand fully when it is that people are authorized to use the exemption on the prepaid accounts and when they are not. And we've been warning you from a spiritual point of view that using the exemption in order to discharge commercial liabilities is in essence getting a gift straight from the Father and the Messiah. And if your intent is to take that gift and use it for any purpose other than the glory of the Father and the Messiah, you're going to wish you'd never done it, because you're going to be in more trouble than you can imagine, not just from the authorities of mankind. So you have to understand what you're doing. You have to understand when it is authorized, when it's being used to the glory of the Father and the Son, and when it is that you're just messing around in order to raise your own ego. We're all supposed to be responsible. Take responsibility for your actions, procedurally and substantively. Yes?
I've been reading in a book that I came across at the bookstore. I can't remember the name, but I'm going to definitely get a copy of the printout. It describes how the bills of exchange were done back in the early 12th and 13th centuries. Something similar to what you just said, that how the transactions are done. I also came across from some research of my own that there are bills of exchange are more from border to border that they have, for like country to country and treasury type form or currency, and the other one is called domestic bill of exchange. I came across that type of word.
Okay.
I guess it was a question.
Question for what? In other words, are there different kinds of bills of exchange?
From what I'm coming across for its terminology, there is something called domestic bill of exchange and then international bill of exchange that they have between countries or borders.
Okay.
But domestic bill of exchange is within the border of territory.
Well, that would probably be like checks written on U.S. accounts or whatever, or there might be something that says that this is payable only in U.S. currency or for domestic use only or whatever. But a bill of exchange is just a draft. And a draft is a request to do something. If it's the commercial realm, it's usually a request to turn over something that is representative or indicative of a commercial monetary exchange, is what you're doing.
I guess the question I have between the draft, because I was looking up definitions of the draft and a bill of exchange, and it said bill of exchanges are usually done in across borders or different countries, from one country to another, than a draft. Is it one and the same, or is it just a different type of a draft?
Well, a draft is a request by one party to a third party to pay a second party a sum of money. That's what a draft is, or a bill of exchange. It's an order by one party to a third party to pay a second party. So it's not a direct relationship between the two parties. It takes on a third party as the outsider, which comes in to do it.
Okay, I was reading in this book, when I get the copy, I'll bring it, where the two merchants made a purchase, and they had a third party pay the first merchant. The third party was I guess it didn't say bank, but they said it would be a place where there was a gathering where the bills of exchange were bought and sold between the people who would have the I guess the draft itself or the paper itself. In which case, no monies were transferred in or out of anything. It was just an exchange by paper.
That's what they're doing today. There's no money. You defined it exactly. They're using bills of exchange because there's no money.
From how I read and understood it, it's like a hot potato. Nothing gets really paid. It just gets transferred from one place to another.
How can you pay anything when there's no money?
That's the same.
Or in the incredible words of the Federal Reserve System through their banking brochures, there is no money. All it is electrons stored in computers.
I remember this from like 10 years ago. They had this little technique where I'm not advocating anything, I'm just saying what I read, was the person gets a credit card and they pay off another credit card and they get another credit card and pay off the other credit card, so it's basically like a loop. It never gets paid off.
Well, what they're doing is just keeping track of debt obligations and discharge of principal and interest.
This is on the same basis, except it's more of on the asset side instead of on a credit side. Where when we say nothing ever gets paid off because there's no money, it's the same, kind of similar, right? Where a credit card, let's say I have a credit card, I max it out, I get another credit card to pay off the first credit card. And I do it back and forth.
That's all you're doing. Because they'll never transfer anything to the asset side or from that to cancel it. Because they took money out of circulation. There is no money.
Last question. The definition of dollar for dollar, are they referring to the notes that says U.S. dollar on there? United States, $1?
What, under HCR 192?
Yeah.
They're just saying that you can exchange things, but you can't pay anything.
Dollar for dollar. What is the definition of dollar for dollar? Dollar is the note? Is that what they've described?
Whatever you've described in terms of quantity in your promise. You promise to pay 100 because there was 100 due and owing. It's dollar for dollar. If you say to them, I'll pay you 80 for your 100, how could that be an exchange? One's greater and one's less. So what they're saying in HGR 192 is you got to exchange equal, which means the future equal is equal to the past equal. Otherwise, you're alluding to a different set of weights and balances, which is a common law cheat. If you said, I promise to pay you 80 to discharge the 100, they'd be going, wait a minute, that wasn't the original terms of the deal. You're proposing an alternate contract. You're not supposed to be proposing an alternate contract. You're supposed to be executing or discharging the terms and conditions of the old obligation. So if they would have said that you can exchange unequal, that would have been a common law cheat, and the HJR 192 would never have flown, because it would have authorized you paying less for what you owe. They can't do that. That's common law cheat. That would be taking private property without permission, which is unconstitutional.
What is on the, as far as the asset side? What are the definitions of those instruments?
On the asset side is gold. At common law.
Okay.
On the asset side, in terms of commercial, you're the owner. You're the one that made the loan. Now the question is, who is the owner? Who's the one that made the loan? And the answer is, beef, it's not your straw man. He's by definition a debtor. So when it comes to your straw man, the creditor of your straw man is the banking corporations, which presume to loan to your straw man. So in their world, the bankers are the creditors. Where did the bankers get their value to loan?
We had to give it to them.
Who we?
We being a living being.
Living being are the ultimate creditors. But that's in the private world. And so you have to understand who you are. Are you the straw man creation? Or are you the living soul who's in the real world and not in their world, who is the ultimate creditor?
Well, the bank's a fiction.
The banks are fictions. But they appear to be the creditor fictions over the creditor debtors. And the only people that appear in the public world are the debtors.
So there's only one asset, and that is the living person. There is no other type of asset. Besides common law being gold.
Don't say that's the only asset. You say that's the only source of commercial energy, is the living person. Everything God created is an asset, including the oceans, the vessels, the trees, animals, the people.
Okay, then
sky.
in the
commercial world,
the instrument,
commercial energy most likely comes from people or what people control. Living souls. So they're the ultimate creditor. And the goal is to operate through the living world, not operate through the fake world, the de facto world. But you've got to understand that everything is witnessed in the de facto world to the public. You can't witness from the de jure world to the public because the public is bankrupt. Which is why I was discussing the movie The Phone Booth. Because the things that people perceived on the street happening was the public world. But the reality is, who was controlling the events that were occurring on the street? The guy in the phone booth, who was a living soul.
He was in the street.
And the sniper, who was a living soul. And when the police responded, they assumed and presumed to know what was going on. And they were ordering the guy in the phone booth to come out of the phone booth with his hands up. He had his hands up with the phone in one hand and say, "I'm not coming out of the phone booth. I can't come out of the phone booth." "Why can't you?" "I can't tell you why I can't come out of the phone booth. I have no gun. I have no weapon. I have harmed no one. I can't come out of the phone booth." Now, what do you got? A public which is totally confused? You think the public was trying to control its situation? You bet. Who was in control? Not the public. Had the public gotten control and this guy left the phone booth, he would have been killed. It would not have resolved the public issue. The guy would not leave the phone booth because the public is not in control. They want to think themselves in control, And a lot of the cops out there said, let's just take him down. And the one cop says, no, we can't do that. He isn't threatening anyone. Well, he killed this guy over here. Well, so we've got witnesses, but he's not threatening anyone right now. Then why doesn't he come out of the phone booth? I don't know. But it gives us no authority to shoot him. Now, there's patriots out there that'll tell you the public will just do anything they want. There is no law. They're not being governed by any law. They're just going to shoot the sucker in the phone booth. And the sniper said, they won't shoot you. And the guy in the phone booth says, why do you think they won't shoot me? He says, because there's television cameras all around here. They will not shoot you. Why won't they shoot him? There's public witnesses. They don't have authority to do what they're doing. And nobody gave them that authority to do that. So are they being led by a form of law? Are they under control? You bet, whether they want to be or not. They're just like everybody else. They've got to deal with what they've been dealt with, and they've got to follow the rules. There were different rules going down there. It wasn't all public. It was private. But this guy that set that phone booth scenario up knew that there would be a public response, and the guy in the phone booth says, they'll find you. He says, they're not even looking for me. Why would they look for me? Unless you tell them, and if you tell them that violates the rule, too much truth, I'll have to kill you. Well, if you shoot someone, they'll hear you. No, they won't. I've got a silencer. They'll think you did it. But I don't have a gun. How do you know? You have to see the story. It was incredible what the sniper did for whatever the purposes. Okay, there's a couple more things that's of interest. The war in Iraq seems to be going very well for the coalition forces. And I heard it said someplace today that there's already stories on the internet now that the military is going like into phase 3 or phase 4. What's that? What happens after the military basically controls the country? What do? Set up a civilian government. In fact, you already heard on television and the newspapers that the military started walking around in the big cities with the police force of that nation. Why do you have a joint police force? To give authenticity to the Iraqi police. Because the Iraqi police now have been witnessed by being with the overrunning forces to have been given the authority for civilian crowd control. So you have a double witness there. And pretty soon when it's obvious, then all you'll need is the Iraqi police. You won't need the U.S. military. Now, they said that some of the first officials into the overrun Iraq come from where? Syria? Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, it's probably pretty de facto. No, not the Taliban. From here where? Representing whom? No, not representing the United States. Huh? Not representing the United Nations. Who's the first ones into the nation? Exiled Iraqi leaders? No. Bankers, IMF. What is the IMF there for? to establish a war scrip. After all, don't we have to have commerce reactivated? And don't we need to do it quickly? So they need to do two things. Initiate a war scrip. How do you initiate a war scrip? You loan it into existence. Who are you going to loan it to? They've got to issue numbers to the people to whom the war scrip is going to be given. So they register and circulate war scrip. So what will the people of Iraq become? Commercial vessels on the high seas of commerce debtors. Much more subtle form of slavery than used to exist that they keep saying, oh, the United States soldiers better go home or we'll just be creating another set of commercial nations like they did 100, 200, 300 years ago when they made all these nations slaves of England and France and everyone else. Now, it's much more subtle now. They're going to loan them money to rebuild, so the IMF is there to circulate a war scrip. After all, we've got to get rid of the old money, because the old money belonged to the enemy. And whoever had that old money, we don't want the enemy to profit by his relationships. So we'll circulate a new war scrip officially for the country, control it, and as we issue it, it will be issued to people who are registered to be able to borrow it, loan it into existence, and do business. Okay, let me ask you, how many people have read in Scripture where in the latter days Babylon's coming back, right? It's going to be rebuilt. Now remember, Babylon was never conquered by war. True? When Persia came in and took over Babylon, did they have to fight Babylon to take over? No. It was a surrender, and it was caused by the death of the Babylonian king. Consequently, the Persians just marched in and took over the empire and renamed it. Probably brought in the IMF with their war scrip and numbered all the people, and now everybody became citizens of the mighty nation of Persia. Now, in Scripture, in the Old Testament, there was a dream that Daniel was privy to, and he interpreted it for the king. And the king said he had this mighty tree that he saw, and somebody basically cut the tree down. But before the tree got cut down, what happened? They banded the trunk with iron below where they cut it down. Which did what? No, it prevented the roots from rotting, giving it the power to resprout. And at end times, Babylon would be restored. Does anybody here believe that the Arabs were going to restore Babylon? Did he restore Babylon, Saddam? His regime is gone. Who is restoring Babylon? Pardon? The coalition forces. Whoever takes over the nation has become the nation de facto. So the coalition forces have walked in, and by their victory have taken over the lands that were Babylon. And it appears to me, in terms of end-time prophecies, the IMF and the World Bank are restoring Babylon as we speak. Is there any doubt about the fact that Babylon has a tremendous store of wealth? that's going to be used to restore it. But who has become Babylon? It's us. There you go. Just thought I'd throw that in there for you people to think about in case you're looking for some other evil people to come in and do your dirty work for you. Be careful what you ask for. You just might get it. Okay, I've been working with some people on some of their criminal cases, and it's very interesting because this one particular gentleman is involved in a criminal case, and he is out on bail.